August 1281. The sky above Kyushu boiled black. Out at sea, 20,000 Mongol ships, the largest invasion fleet the world had ever seen, filled the horizon from end to end. On the cliffs, 5,000 samurai waited, silent beneath the thunder. They could smell the storm before they saw it, a pressure in the air, a pulse in the waves. The Mongols had come to crush Japan, to erase it in a single blow. But that night, the sea itself turned against them. When the wind screamed and the rain came sideways, the ocean became a weapon. By dawn, the fleet was gone. Hulls splintered, bodies floating in silence. 5,000 men still stood on the shore, untouched. The storm the Mongols called Divine Wind had a name, Kamikaze, and it would change history forever. The summer of 1281 had been unnaturally still. The fishermen of Kyushu said the sea had grown heavy, like it was waiting for something. Then one morning the horizon darkened, not with storm clouds, but with sails. Dozens, hundreds, thousands. The invasion of Japan had begun. Across the water came the combined might of the Mongol Empire, an armada of 4,400 ships carrying more than 140,000 men, Koreans, Chinese, and Mongols united under the banner of Kublai Khan. Their mission was clear: conquer Japan, capture its emperor, and erase a defiant island from the map. No one in Asia had ever stood against the Mongols for long. Every nation from the steppes to the South China Sea had already bowed. Japan would be next. But on the cliffs of Hakata Bay, only 5,000 samurai stood waiting. Farmers, fishermen, and warriors bound by oath, not by empire. Their armor was lacquered black, their blades curved and shining like moonlight on water. They knew they could not stop an army that large. They did not plan to. Their only purpose was to buy time, to fight until the gods chose sides. The Mongol fleet advanced with perfect precision. Drums thundered from the decks, orders shouted across the waves in a dozen tongues. Siege engines and catapults bristled from the ships' prows, ready to turn Japan's shorelines into flame. From the cliffs, the samurai watched, their banners snapping in the sea wind, their prayers whispered to the storm clouds gathering above. At dusk, the first Mongol ships dropped anchor. The soldiers aboard laughed when they saw how few defenders stood waiting. They didn't know that Japan had spent the last 7 years preparing for this very night. Behind the beaches stretched miles of stone walls and wooden spikes, a fortress built from faith and desperation. The samurai had turned the shoreline itself into a trap. Then the wind shifted. The drums fell silent. Far out to sea, thunder began to roll. The Mongols looked up, frowning at the horizon. The sky was changing color. The ocean had started to breathe, slow, deep, and angry. The night ahead would not belong to any army. It would belong to the sea. The Mongols struck first. Thousands of arrows hissed through the air, blackening the dusk. Firepots followed, arching high before smashing into the shore and shattering into waves of flame. The samurai did not retreat. They stood in silence, waiting for the enemy to land. When the first wave of invaders jumped from their ships and splashed through the shallows, the horns of Japan finally answered. Conch shells wailed across the cliffs, long, low, and defiant. Drums thundered back from the hills. The samurai surged forward as one, their war cries cutting through the wind. Tenka Fubu! Rule under heaven! The clash was instant. Brutal. Mongol shields met katana steel. Arrows snapped on lacquered armor. The beach turned black with men locked in combat. The samurai fought like shadows, appearing and vanishing through the smoke. They moved in small groups, striking fast, retreating before the next wave could land. They knew every inch of the shoreline, every rock, every channel, every current. By nightfall, the Mongols had taken the sand but not the land beyond it. Their numbers worked against them. Too many men, too little space, all hemmed in by cliffs and walls that turned their advantage into chaos. Out at sea, more ships pushed forward, trying to bring reinforcements to the beach. But the tide was changing. The wind had begun to howl, tearing at sails and snapping masts. The sky above the fleet was no longer blue. It had turned a strange metallic gray. Lightning flickered across the water, white and silent, like the eyes of gods watching from the clouds. On shore, a wounded samurai named Masashige leaned on his sword and looked out at the growing storm. "They are too many," his comrade said. Masashige shook his head. "No," he murmured, "they have angered the sea." The first wave of rain hit like stones. The Mongol banners flattened in the gale. On their decks, sailors screamed to cut anchors, but the wind had already claimed the ships. The storm that had been building all evening finally broke. And in a heartbeat, the invasion of Japan became a struggle to survive the night. The wind came first, a wall of air so strong it ripped sails from their masts and snapped ropes like threads. Mongol ships collided in the dark, their hulls grinding and splintering under the weight of the storm. Thunder rolled over the bay, so loud it drowned out the cries of men and the crash of waves. Lightning tore the sky open in jagged veins, flashing across a fleet that stretched beyond sight, now breaking apart piece by piece. On the cliffs, the samurai could see nothing but white fury. Rain hammered the rocks in sheets. The sea below was no longer water, but chaos. Whirlpools blooming where ships once floated, fire from shattered lanterns flickering on waves that looked like molten glass. For the first time in their lives, the samurai did not fight. They only watched. The gods had entered the battle. Far out on the water, Mongol soldiers clung to the decks, screaming prayers in a dozen languages. Some tried to row toward shore, but the waves were taller than towers. Ships capsized in seconds. Others broke apart mid-cry, their wooden ribs snapping like bones. The smell of salt and smoke filled the air, the scent of armies dying. One Chinese ship caught fire when lightning struck its mast. The blaze spread across its tar-soaked hull, illuminating the surrounding sea. For a heartbeat, the entire fleet was visible. Thousands of ships rolling helplessly on a boiling ocean. Then the light vanished, and the storm swallowed them whole. The samurai huddled beneath their cloaks, unable to speak. They had prayed for deliverance. Now they were witnessing it. Masashige, the wounded warrior from the beach, whispered into the storm. "This is not our doing." His comrade nodded. "No," he said, "this is the wind of the gods." By midnight, the waves reached the shore, dragging the wrecks of great Mongol ships onto the reefs and tearing them to pieces. The beach, where the samurai had fought hours earlier, was now covered in debris, planks, armor, and bodies glowing faintly under flashes of lightning. The storm raged on, merciless, divine. And through it all, the warriors of Japan stood unmoving, their torches guttering in the wind, watching as the sea devoured an empire. When morning came, the world was silent. The sea that had roared through the night now lay still, its surface a mirror of pale gray sky. But beneath that calm floated the remains of an empire. Thousands of ships, splintered, overturned, burned to their keels, drifted in slow circles across Hakata Bay. The tide carried bodies ashore, soldiers tangled in ropes and shattered masts, their armor gleaming faintly beneath the rising sun. The samurai walked down from the cliffs without a word. Their sandals sank into wet sand blackened with pitch and ash. Everywhere they looked, the sea had left offerings, swords, shields, banners twisted around broken oars. The Mongol invasion had vanished in a single night. What the armies of Asia could not destroy, the sea had erased in hours. Masashige, his arms still bound from battle, knelt beside a drowned Mongol officer, half buried in the sand. In the man's hand was a flag still bearing the Khan's sigil. Masashige placed his palm over it and whispered, "Even kings must bow to the wind." Then he rose and looked toward the horizon, where sunlight broke through the last of the clouds. The storm was gone, but its memory hung in the air, a tension, a holiness. When the priests of Dazaifu arrived days later to record the destruction, they found the shore littered with relics. One chronicler wrote, "The ocean rose to defend us, and the thunder spoke in our tongue." The people began calling it Kamikaze, the divine wind. To them, it was not mere weather, but intervention, a proof that the gods had chosen Japan. Across the sea, news reached Kublai Khan's court. The emperor of the world refused to believe it. He demanded another fleet, another invasion, until his generals showed him the maps. Every harbor marked with wrecks, every shipyard empty, every coast haunted by whispers of that storm. The greatest navy ever built had ceased to exist. On the beaches of Kyushu, the survivors built shrines from the wreckage, small altars made from the Mongols' own timbers, candles burning on the bones of ships that once promised conquest. When the wind returned days later, it carried the smell of salt and incense. The sea was calm again, but Japan would never see it as ordinary water. It was a god now, vast and watchful, its loyalty proven in lightning and rain. In the weeks that followed, the scale of the catastrophe became clear. The Mongol invasion force, once a floating city of men and weapons, was gone. Entire fleets had vanished beneath the waves. Of the 20,000 ships that left China's coast, barely a few hundred limped back. Tens of thousands of soldiers were dead, drowned, or stranded on foreign shores where the locals hunted them like ghosts. When word reached Kublai Khan in his palace at Khanbalik, the great ruler of the Mongol world fell silent. For decades, his armies had crushed kingdoms and empires alike. He had defeated dynasties, burned capitals, rewritten borders. He had believed himself unstoppable. But the sea, that wild, invisible frontier, had answered him in kind. His advisors whispered that the gods of Japan had sent a storm to protect their land. The Khan's eyes darkened. "There are no gods," he said, "only weather." But even he didn't believe his own words. In Japan, the people treated the wreckage as sacred. Fishermen found helmets tangled in coral, ships wedged into coves, and strange foreign coins washing ashore like offerings. Monks gathered the relics and carried them to shrines where incense burned day and night. The emperor declared 7 days of thanks to the kami, divine spirits of wind and sea. And on the cliffs of Hakata Bay, the samurai stood in quiet awe. They had fought with swords, but victory had come from something greater. Masashige returned to his village with one piece of the enemy, a curved Mongol blade he had found lodged in the sand. He hung it in his home, blade down, as a reminder. When his son asked what it meant, he replied, "Even the sharpest sword cannot cut the wind." Kublai Khan's empire would never fully recover from the loss. The expense of the failed invasion drained his treasury and shattered his fleets. The myth of Mongol invincibility, the terror that had swept across continents, began to fade. In its place grew a new legend whispered across Asia, that Japan was the land the gods themselves defended. And so the sea became Japan's oldest ally, its unseen wall. The Mongols would never return. The divine wind had drawn a boundary no emperor could cross, a line written not in ink or stone, but in storm. When the last waves fell quiet, the coast lay under a pale sky that smelled of salt and ashes. The people of Kyushu crept down from the hills, expecting to find armies waiting for them. Instead, they found only wreckage, the ocean still spitting out what it had swallowed. Spears, armor, horses, and men all tangled together in seaweed and rope. The sand was black where fires had burned. The priests called it a miracle before the first hour had passed. The Kaze no Kami, the spirits of the wind, had heard their prayers. Farmers knelt in the surf, scooping seawater in their hands as if touching the proof of divine favor. Soldiers, still dressed in soaked armor, began chanting hymns usually reserved for the new year. Even the shogun's messengers wept when they saw the bay littered with the bones of a vanished empire. The survivors from the Mongol fleet who reached shore met no army, only silence. Most were too weak to fight. Some threw down their swords, others crawled into the forest and never came out. Those who were captured were tended by monks who spoke to them softly, as if addressing men already dead. When the storm clouds finally drifted away, the horizon cleared for the first time in days. Nothing remained but floating debris, the ribs of ships jutting from the water like gravestones. The sea was calm again, but it no longer seemed alive. It was a graveyard that stretched to the edge of the world. The samurai stood on the shore through the night, watching the tide carry the dead back to the open ocean. Masashige pressed his hands together, bowing deeply toward the waves. "The gods fought for us," he whispered, "and may they rest now." By dawn, the beach was empty. Only the sound of gulls remained, echoing over the wrecks, the cries of a new legend being born from the ruins of an empire. In the weeks that followed, the story spread faster than the storm itself. Messengers galloped through mountain passes and across the islands, carrying the same impossible words. The sea has destroyed the Mongols. Entire temples filled with offerings. Priests struck great bronze bells that rang for hours, their deep voices rolling over the valleys. The people knelt wherever they stood, whispering thanks to the kami who had saved them. At Dazaifu, the Shinto scholars gathered to write the first account. They named the storm Kamikaze, the divine wind. In their scrolls they wrote, "The spirits of heaven rose to guard our shores. The ocean obeyed their breath to them. It was not coincidence. It was proof that Japan itself was sacred, chosen, untouchable." Meanwhile, the Mongol survivors who washed ashore told another story. They spoke of the sky turning green before the lightning struck, of a sound like 1,000 drums from beneath the waves. Some said they saw figures walking on the water, cloaked in mist, their faces hidden behind masks of light. Their accounts were half prayer, half nightmare. But they agreed on one thing. No human force could have caused what they saw. In China, Kublai Khan demanded to know how an empire could be drowned. His generals bowed low, afraid to speak. "We faced no army," one said finally, "only the wrath of the sky." The Khan clenched his fists and turned away. For the first time in his reign, the great Khan, the ruler of half the known world, was powerless. The maps in his palace still showed Japan, a tiny island at the edge of everything. But now it seemed larger, invincible. Back in Kyushu, the samurai began rebuilding their shrines and seawalls. The wrecked ships became their monuments. Children played among the timbers that once carried the might of the Mongol horde, their laughter echoing where war cries had faded. And every evening, when the wind rose from the sea, the elders would look to the horizon and bow, not out of fear, but gratitude. They believed the gods had not merely defended Japan, they had revealed its destiny, and in that belief, a new nation was born, one bound by the certainty that heaven itself guarded its shores, and that no invader could ever breach the will of the divine wind. Years passed, and the wrecks sank slowly into the depths. Coral grew around shattered hulls, ropes turned to threads, and the sea began to heal. Fishermen said their nets sometimes caught bits of bronze or iron from the deep, Mongol blades, rusted beyond use. They would place them back into the water, whispering, "Return to your God." Monks along the Kyushu coast built shrines from driftwood and fragments of armor, their altars facing the horizon. At night, the tide carried faint lights offshore, lanterns set adrift to honor the drowned. From a distance, they looked like stars fallen onto the sea. Each one represented a soul claimed by the storm. Generations later, divers would find bones still sealed inside the wrecks, the skeletons of men who once believed the world could be conquered. Their ships had been built by human hands, but their destruction had come from something beyond any empire's reach. Japan never forgot. The Kamikaze became more than a storm. It became a memory that shaped a nation's heart. The word itself entered legend, whispered in poems and battle cries alike. It came to mean more than protection. It meant destiny. The divine would intervene again and again to shield the island when courage alone was not enough. And yet the sea, vast and impassive, kept its own counsel. It had no loyalty, only memory. Every wave that broke along Kyushu's shores carried a trace of that night. The roar of thunder, the hiss of rain, the fleeting reflection of fire on black water. Even now, when storms gather over the East China Sea, the elders listen to the wind and murmur, "The gods are walking again." Centuries later, when divers descended into Hakata Bay, they found the storm's truth sleeping beneath the silt. The bones of ships, anchors twisted like rope, arrowheads scattered in the sand like fallen stars. The sea had kept its secret, but not forever. The wreckage told the story word for word. 20,000 ships erased in a single night. The divine wind had been real. Historians would call it nature. Poets would call it destiny. Japan remembered it as something greater, proof that faith could shape the elements themselves. The Kaze no Kami, the wind gods, had spared the nation when no wall, no sword, no emperor could. And so the word Kamikaze became eternal, a prayer, a warning, a vow. Today, the waves still break on Kyushu's shore, indifferent yet familiar. The fishermen bow before setting sail, their voices lost to the same wind that once destroyed an empire. When the sea grows dark and the air turns heavy, they whisper the old words again, half in reverence, half in fear. Protect this land. Guard our home. The storm that saved Japan has long since passed, but its echo still rides the wind. If stories like this move you, where history feels alive, and nature itself becomes a weapon, subscribe and listen to the next forgotten dawn the past left behind.